Good morning, everyone, and thanks for making it to this panel discussion on the current crisis in Myanmar, particularly over the Rohingya refugees. We have a very interesting panel here with us today, Ambassador Shyam Saran, who is former Foreign Secretary, Special Envoy to the Prime Minister on climate change and nuclear affairs, but also a former ambassador to Myanmar, somebody who's studied that country and followed its politics very, very closely. We have Professor Nimi Kurian, colleague at CPR, who's again a specialist on India and Southeast Asia, has made particularly deep study of borderlands and the kinds of issues that we want to talk about today. So what prompted this session really was to take stock of both the situation around the Rohingya refugee crisis as it is currently playing out, but also give us a chance to ask our two experts here to help us unravel the many layers that there are to this conflict, because this is a crisis which in some ways is has been in the making only for the last 5 or 6 years. The first sort of attack on the Rohingyas happened in 2012, but it is a crisis which has roots going much deeper in the history and politics of the country and of the region as well. And one of the things we wanted to first, get a sense was how do we sort of understand what the current situation is, and then talk a little bit about what it means for India and examine India's foreign policy response so far, which and how that's likely to shape up, and then possibly also look a little bit about what it means for the region as a whole, because this is clearly one of the biggest refugee crises that South Asia has confronted in recent years. An estimated 500,000 to 600,000 Rohingyas have moved out of Myanmar and are set up in various kinds of temporary refugee camps in Bangladesh, with the possibility that many more will find ways of sort of moving on to other parts of the region from there. So, to start with, maybe, sir, I could ask you if you could just give us a sense of what exactly is the nature of the problem? Because as I understand it, there are 2 or 3 things to it. One is the Rakhine state itself and its peculiar sort of relationship with the state of Myanmar. There is a regional dimension to the problem. There is a intra sort of Rakhine problem between the Rohingya, who are sort of a Muslim minority there, and the majority Rakhine Buddhists. And the Rakhine Buddhists themselves have had a tricky relationship with the government of Myanmar, which you followed when you were there as well. So I just want to sort of request you to kick off with giving us an overview of what are the various sort of levels at which we need to really unpack this situation, and then maybe we can take it from there.
Thank you very much, Srinath, and I'm very happy to see that we have a very good turnout this morning, despite horrendous traffic jams around this area. And I would like to particularly thank His Excellency, the High Commissioner of Bangladesh, who has very kindly made himself present at this meeting. So let me just give you a sense of what I know of this issue from my time in Myanmar. I have visited the Rakhine state, and even I'm talking about 1997 to 2001, when I was ambassador in Myanmar. Even at that time, I had gone there around the year 2000. There was actually a major problem with the Rohingyas, because even though we had not seen the scale of violence which we have seen recently, there is no doubt that they were, in every sense of the word, a persecuted minority. And even at that time, the UN had organized our visit, and we had gone to some of the camps, although, of course, these camps were within Myanmar itself, but there were internally displaced families living in those camps. There have been, on and off, there have been violent incidents, mainly involving a very militant clergy, particularly in the Rakhine state. Of course, with the the restoration of multi-party democracy. In a sense, there was a loosening of controls all around, and much of this prejudice and hostility, which was always there under the surface, actually came to the surface. And the situation is complicated by the fact that, of course, the Myanmar army, which continues to be one of the most, one of the most powerful entities in Myanmar, despite the democratic transition which is taking place, they have looked upon this issue mainly through the security lens. Essentially because they have been, over the years, involved in anti-insurgency campaigns against a large number of ethnic groups along the periphery of Myanmar. And yes, there is a group of Rohingyas who have taken to militancy, who have taken to violence. There is the Rohingya, the ARSA, the Salvation Army, which has been in the news. But there have been groups which have in the past also engaged in insurgency, and therefore the Myanmar army's view of this whole situation is very much from that security lens, what they have faced with ethnic groups in other parts of the country. So on the one hand, you have that kind of opposition and hostility from the Myanmar army. And as I said, even at that time, even though the clergy, as I think Srinath was hinting, which had a rather difficult relationship with the military regime, despite that, the fact is that the local clergy, for example, whom I spoke to during that visit, the hostility and prejudice was palpable. So the clergy is actually a very powerful entity too in Myanmar. It has tremendous amount of influence, and even those days the military regime was rather wary of the clergy, and had also tried to buy off much of the leadership of the clergy by giving them a lot of perks as well. But essentially, this is a very powerful entity too in the country. And lastly, I would like to mention, this is an unfortunate fact, that if you went around speaking to people, ordinary people in Myanmar, the Burmans, as it were, you'd be surprised how much of that prejudice is there amongst the, ordinary people as well. This is something which is therefore very difficult. I'm not surprised that for somebody like Aung San Suu Kyi, this is something very difficult to handle, because her taking a stand in perhaps trying to resolve this issue would be very, very unpopular in a sense, not only with these two most powerful entities, but also the general, Burman constituency, which is really her support base. Now, the history, of course, most of you know. Most of the people who are classed as Rohingyas are not recent immigrants, although there may have been some recent immigration. But the fact is that most of them really have been living here for generations, the problem, in a sense, arose because there are other ethnic groups in Myanmar as well who are recognized as ethnic groups and belonging to Myanmar. You have in 1982, when the citizenship law was passed, where many of these 135 ethnic groups of Myanmar were recognized as ethnic groups and therefore also part of Myanmar and rightfully entitled to citizenship. The Rohingyas were not included in that grouping. So, in a sense, from that point onward, very formally they became stateless. Whether or not that will change in the future, very difficult to say. The general, if you go to Myanmar, the general sense is these are foreigners. They are illegally here, and they need to be need to be reported. Of course, there are other things which also start coming in the way. A lot of negative history is dredged up. After the Second World War, when India was becoming independent, partition happened. There were groups of Rohingyas who did actually ask to be incorporated in East Pakistan. So that also is conjured up every now and then by the Myanmaris as demonstrating, in fact, that the Rohingyas never felt that they were part of Myanmar. They always identified themselves with people on the other side of the border. Now, this is just to understand, in a sense, what you wanted to, what is the background to this. But then we come to what the present is. As I said, there have been every now and then there has been eruption of violence. And as I mentioned to you, when I went several years ago, there were already these camps for internally displaced Rohingyas. What has made perhaps the current situation much more difficult to handle is the fact that, as you know, sometime I think in August, there was an attack on, say, something like 30 police posts of the police and I think army posts by the ARSA, and this led to therefore a very large scale sort of retaliation by the Myanmar security forces. Of course, most of the ordinary people, Rohingya people, were certainly not involved in this violence, but they had to suffer the consequence of the attack which had taken place. Much has been said about the position of Aung San Suu Kyi. What she has in private indicated is that it is, as I mentioned, almost impossible for her to take any position on this without there being a big sort of retaliation by particularly the Myanmar army, which in a sense is still not quite reconciled to the political change which has taken place. I think it would be fair to say that under very difficult circumstances, essentially what Aung San Suu Kyi has been trying to do is to keep pushing the envelope bit by bit to expand the room for maneuver for the civilian government. I think we should give her credit for that. Yes, people do expect, having been a Nobel laureate, that she would take a much more open and unambiguous stand on this. Maybe she has not quite lived up to those expectations, but frankly, I see her as having already made a transition to being a politician, and I think, like any politician, she is looking at her political survival first before looking at other things. But essentially, what she tried to do was, I think, by inviting Kofi Annan to look into this situation under great opposition from the Myanmar army, I can tell you. So this was one way of trying to somehow deflect the pressure. And the report of Kofi Annan was actually accepted by the Aung San Suu Kyi government, and they said that they would implement most of the recommendations. So that's an encouraging sign. Many of those recommendations relate to how to improve the livelihood of the people, Rohingya people, how to try and improve the security situation in the region. Not so much in terms of the citizenship issue, etc., but at least some recommendations are there which are encouraging. The speech that she made, where she said that those who can be verified are welcome to come back, thereby keeping at least some door open for the return of the refugees. Of course, I think the return can only be once the proper situation is created within Rakhine State itself. It would be fair to say that those conditions currently do not exist. I mean, we have to recognize that. It is, as Srinath mentioned, an extremely difficult situation. There is a UN fact-finding team which is led by, I think, Indira Jaisingh, if I'm not mistaken.
She's no longer the head.
No?
No.
There was Radhika Kumaraswamy and Sri Lankan, yeah, and an Australian, if I'm not mistaken. But as far as I know, that fact-finding team has not yet made a visit. Yeah. That also, of course, is rejected by the Myanmar army, and we are therefore, faced with a situation where there is a lot of internal jostling going on within Myanmar itself. So now let me end by just talking about the Indian position, and I think even in the past there have been Rohingyas who have sort of come into India. Not much notice has been taken of that because these have not been very large groups which have come to India. I'm told that there may be altogether something like 40,000 in India, out of which maybe 14,000 have come in the recent past. This is the figure which I was able to get. Many of those who had come earlier are, in fact, not even in the border areas. Many of them are settled in different parts of the country, even here in Delhi, and you may have seen reports about there being even in Jammu and Kashmir. So they are in fact spread all over. There are two aspects to the Indian reaction. One is great anxiety about the security aspect. With this influx, would there be also some IS-related or pro-Pakistani group-related elements who would also come in, and then we would have a security challenge on our hands, and therefore we have to be every reason to be very mindful and careful about that. The second aspect, of course, has been that we should not do anything which goes against our humanitarian tradition and our generally accommodating stance towards those who may be fleeing persecution from other countries. It would be fair to say that generally speaking, the whatever be the reaction of some elements in the government, that general reaction here has been that we should in fact be, we should not take the extreme step of trying to deport people, although we should be mindful of the security aspect. But I do not think that at this point of the time deportation is something which is seriously on the cards. But what about the political stance of India? I think there has been perhaps a more salience given to the security aspect, perhaps less salience to the humanitarian aspect. But very quickly, I think the government has realized the downside to this stance and has in fact tried to see whether, given its very good relations with both Myanmar as well as Bangladesh, is there something that quietly, discreetly we can do to try and promote some kind of a understanding. Second has been, of course, somewhat belatedly for the government of India to offer and extend assistance, particularly to the refugees who are now in camps in Bangladesh. I think that has been appreciated. But again, I am told that the scale of assistance which is required by Bangladesh is much more than what has been on offer, and this need for assistance will probably continue for a longer period of time. Frankly, whatever we do, my own sense is, and I have written that we are between a rock and a hard place, given the very good relations that we have with Bangladesh. We have good relations with Myanmar. There is quite understandably a sentiment that let us not do anything which may spoil our relations with either country. And with Bangladesh particularly, given the fact that over the last few years, very significant improvement has taken place in the relations between the two countries. The sentiment amongst the people have also undergone a positive change. And it is precisely this kind of an issue which can reverse a lot of the gains that have been made. Therefore, there need to be very careful in how we handle this issue. Likewise, with respect to Myanmar, there the quite apart from the importance that we attach, that the evolution of the democratic change that is taking place in Myanmar should in fact continue. There should not be a setback. We believe that it's a positive change. We believe that on balance, Aung San Suu Kyi is facing very difficult odds and has been somewhat successful in trying to have the multi-party democracy sort of aim still very much in focus. That is one aspect that we would like to see a continuance of the positive political change in Myanmar. Second is that with respect to Myanmar, as you know, 4 of our most sensitive northeastern states border Myanmar. That is starting from Arunachal, you have Nagaland, you have Manipur, and you have Mizoram. And it would be fair to say that a very good cooperation is required between India and Myanmar to, in a sense, help us deal with the challenging situation along this very sensitive border. And actually, Myanmar has been quite helpful over the last several years, and we would not like to see that cooperation somehow undermined as a result of new misunderstanding which may arise. Whether we like it or not, there is a China factor in play, and that also introduces an element of caution in how we deal with issues of this kind. And lastly, Rakhine itself is very important for India for the simple reason that we currently have, as you know, major project for the upgradation of the Sitwe port. We have a major project which is called the Multimodal Transport Corridor project from Sitwe going into Mizoram along the Kaladan river. And we also have oil and gas interests in the Rakhine state. And you would be also perhaps surprised to know that the projects that we are undertaking in Rakhine, most of the labor is actually Rohingya labor. So when the last time round when these riots took place in Sitwe, our project came to a halt because all the workers, in fact, either had been targeted or they had to run away. So the project was delayed for several months because we simply did not have any labor. So there is also that dimension to this issue. So it is in our interest that the situation in Rakhine state actually stabilizes, is peaceful, because it will enable us to continue with what we consider to be rather important and even, in fact, strategic projects. So let me stop here. And then
Sure. No, thanks. That was quite a tour de force of all the major issues. And then I'll come back to you to elaborate on some specific points. Maybe, Nimi, I can turn to you for a little bit more on the sort of background to how this question of citizenship has evolved within Myanmar itself. See, because the Rohingya issue has got, as Ambassador Saran said, certain kinds of historical peculiarities. When I was working on the Second World War in the subcontinent, that was a very important period because the Rakhine state, as it used to be known, Arakan back then, was the front line of the conflict between British India and Japan, right? And it changed hands both sides quite a bit, right? And in fact, many of the divisions in that area actually go back to that period between 1942 and 45, because the Japanese were mobilizing the sort of Rakhine Buddhists to act to provide supplies to them while the British Indian Army was mobilizing the Rohingya Muslims to, act as sort of, their special forces for interdiction and such like things. And that in many ways, in the post-Second World War period, which Ambassador Saran referred to, proved to be one of the first sort of triggering points for that. And then you had this Mujahid insurgency starting very soon after.
If I may add, that
Sure,
it
sir.
was precisely the experience of the Second World War,
Yeah.
and when Rakhine played a very important role, that this Kalanan River project, the corridor project, actually came about, because this was the corridor which was used precisely for the supplies.
Yeah. And many of the towns where the recent sort of rounds of violence against the Rohingyas have happened, they were all at the front line of the Second World War, right? The Battle of the Box was actually fought around Butidong and those places. So I just want to sort of help you, for you to help us to get a sense of what the background to the 1982 Citizenship Act was. And why was this particular decision taken to leave these people out? Because see, 1978 was, I think, the first recorded instance of large-scale violence against the Rohingyas, right? Yes. About 150,000 of them actually went to Bangladesh, yes. And many were resettled in Myanmar. Repatriation happened, yes. But nevertheless, that remained an issue. So if you can just, because that seems to be a very pivotal moment in the way that this issue developed.
Thank you, Srinath, and I'm not too sure if I can add anything of value to what after this very sweeping and brilliant snapshot view that Ambassador Saran and your own inputs, Srinath, but I'll try. You're right. There's a fair bit of historical narrative to this, to the issue and the way it has unfolded. That we need to be kind of, cognizant of, which very often is really missing in the mainstream discourse. I think the way I see it, I see the Rohingyas as really, unwittingly or tragically caught in what is Myanmar's post-colonial identity discourse. And as I said, there's a fair bit of difficult, bitter history here. A lot of it relating to what Ambassador Saran and Srinath mentioned. But also, just to add to that, is the fact that in this historical narrative, the Rohingyas happen to be on the wrong side. It happened to be on the wrong side of this mainstream historical narrative. The reason I say this is because in the Second World War, the Rohingyas decided, it was a choice that they took to side with the British in the hope that they would be given what the British promised, a Muslim national area at the end of the war for their support. And so they do this at a time when much of the nationalists, pretty much all of the nationalists in Burma are fighting against the British. So you see, they are completely, you see the bitter fault lines dating back to that. And so that is where I would kind of date some of these. These are like deep currents. Some of what we are seeing now is a further spike in tensions and bloodshed, but these have, as Ambassador Saran and Srinath mentioned, deep currents, which, and the point that you mentioned, Srinath, is very crucial, because this, again, as I said, the Rohingyas caught up in Myanmar's post-colonial identity narrative, and the first clear disturbing sign of this would be the 1982 citizenship law. And what it does is really to set 1823 as a date for citizenship to be granted to its nationals. Now, why would 1823? Why would the date 1823 be so compelling in its national narrative? It is compelling because that is the year following which the British, wage a series of 3 wars in with Burma, and which by the end of the 1880s, Burma, all of Burma is pretty much absorbed into British Indian Empire. So some of that, so you see, this is the construction of the national self, as it were, is can be traced to 1823, where you, despite evidence, historical evidence that the Rohingyas, as Ambassador Saran said, have been in living in the Arakan, which incidentally was an independent kingdom, since as early as 12th century, and some there's mention of as early as the 8th century. So they came in when, as a result of Arab, traders, and that there's a fair bit of history there as well. So some of that 1982 citizenship law is part of that discourse where the Rohingyas find themselves on the on the opposite side, and that I would say is for the history bit. And if you want me to respond to Aung San Suu Kyi's role, or maybe later?
Pick that up later.
Yeah, sure.
One thing I wanted to sort of probe you a little further was on, see, the 1982 Act also happens in the context of almost 20 years of military rule already under General Ne Win in Burma. And the Burmese army's sort of entire principle there is that you want to construct one ethnically sort of coherent nation, and then you have all these other sort of ethnic minorities with whom insurgencies and other conflicts are being fought. And as Ambassador Saran said, the Act identifies 135 nationalities, right? But the Rohingya, who are in a sense a minority within a minority, because the Rakhine Buddhists themselves are a minority in a certain sense, are sort of left out of this particular story. So the question that I sort of wanted you to help us understand is that, what, apart from the fact that, there is this kind of historical legacy and current and so on, was the reason to pick on the Rohingyas in quite this way? Because the Burmese nationalist sort of argument was that a lot of them were very recent refugees from Bangladesh, and that they were not actually people who had sort of been there historically and so on. So could you just tell us a little bit more about how that, the Rohingya sort of exclusion really came into being, and what the storyline behind that was?
So some of that has to do with, let's say, a very troubling or a very compelling statistics. When you look at Burma as a country, it's made up. Look at its ethnic profile. Really, 88% of Burma is made up of Buddhists. Is the Buddhist majority country, and some of that gives you a sense. So 88% of is made up of Buddhists. So some of that gives you a sense of where that discourse is coming. It plays into what Ambassador Saran referred to as also the recent radicalization within right-wing Buddhist forces. Like you have this in 2014, an ultra right-wing Buddhist group called the Mahabharata, which actually stands for racial purity. And it's if you listen to their speeches, which are translated, you get a sense of there's this the entire platform is on an anti-Muslim, anti-Muslim discourse, and it's their hate speeches, and so even after it is banned, promptly banned by the authorities, what do? The Mahabharata actually goes ahead and promptly gets itself a new name, and goes ahead to very quietly rebrand itself. It does so by opening Sunday Buddhist schools, by opening legal clinics, doing a whole bunch of social, cultural outreach activities, all with an eye at the 2020 general elections. So you see the othering of this minority actually, as I said, plays into this larger construction of the of Burmese identity, and it really, I would say, goes back to that. And it's a very difficult, and because, as I said, it's a bitter history, it's very difficult to scrub that out. No amount of reconciliation or is going to really erase that from people's memories. And as Ambassador Saran said, it's true that there is a fair bit of social deep-seated social angst, if you will, or resentment against the Muslims. For instance, I was in fact very shocked to read that recently when a ship laden with relief material came for the Rohingyas came from Malaysia. Malaysian NGOs had put together. There was this huge procession or protest marches with banners which said no, no to Rohingya, and a lot of like real strong language at opposing this, even at the humanitarian level, to be able to differentiate or allow relief materials for even unaccompanied children or women at risk. There's absolutely no space left in the social imagination, as it were.
Sir, before we sort of get on to the more recent events, because I do think that what has happened in Myanmar since 2010-11 has also got something to do with the democratic transition that is happening there. Because while these issues do have very long histories and so on, I think we should be a little wary of assuming that these are all things which were ever present, because somehow these materials have been put together in a very short period, as you said, by Buddhist clergy, outfits like these. But the fact is that the Myanmar state, particularly the army, even after under the Slork period when you were ambassador there, they were pursuing a set of policies which were aimed at more or less making sure that the Rohingyas are squeezed out even of their areas. For instance, one of the things that they pursued from the late 90s onwards is this whole idea of creating settlement colonies, where they got actually basically prisoners from various prisons in Myanmar who are Buddhists to go and live in these areas. They were given land, they were given cow, they were given money. They were said that about 80 of these kinds of settlement colonies were set up all along northern Rakhine, which is where the Rohingyas live. So clearly there is a certain kind of a policy by the state also, which apart from whatever societal level frictions have been happening, which have led to the recent past. So would you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so let me try and just put this in some perspective. Don't forget that after Myanmar, Burma became independent, we have had in the earlier period, two major sort of movement of peoples out of Myanmar. One was of course, a smaller group, the Chettiars, who were dispossessed of whatever land they had acquired as a result of because of the financial crisis. They were the bankers, so much of the land came to them as a result. And Mr. Nehru actually acquiesced in that. Then we have a period of 1961 to 64 when Nevin was ruling Burma. As many as 350,000 Indians actually had to leave Burma. Most of them had to leave behind their property, even movable. One of the strange things I discovered in the embassy was a huge iron safe for which there was no key. And then finally, when I got it opened, there were little bags of jewelry, which the Indians who were running away from Myanmar, they had actually deposited with the embassy in the hope that sometime or the other they would probably be able to come back and claim their property. So there were 350,000 Indians who left. This was as a result of two programs which Nevin instituted. One was the Burmanization program, which meant that all institutions, administration, universities, other places, would all be forced to use the Burmese language. Most of the utilities there, like the postal service, the railway service, most of the educational institutions, Rangoon University was one of the premier universities in Asia at that time. Most of the faculty was Indians. Most of the utilities, like the railways, were run by Indians. Rangoon was more an Indian city rather than a Burmese city. More than 60%, 65% of the population was actually Indian origin. And so one was the Burmanization program, and then the other was the nationalization program, which meant that except for very small establishments, virtually all businesses were nationalized, and a large number of the businesses, particularly in Rangoon, were in fact Indian businesses. So there was also at that time, don't forget, there was a very, very great hostility to the Indian population there. And this exodus was very much a result of that, precisely that historical narrative that you're talking about. So, in a sense, there is a certain link between what we are seeing happen today, perhaps in more extreme form, for a trend which we have seen for quite some time, of this sense that because of the British Empire we were somehow inundated by immigrants from all over the place, and the Rohingyas are very much part and parcel of that particular exercise which took place. So I think in the new political environment, in which some space has been created for some competitive politics, which was missing before, it is no surprise to me that this has become a very powerful mobilizing force. Mobilizing force for both the new civilian parties, but also a very powerful force for the clergy and the army to try and trip up the other side. That it's like what you see sometimes here. Unless you wear your patriotism on the sleeve, you are in trouble. So it's a similar kind of a situation that is beginning to be mobilized there. That historical narrative has become very, very powerful. These are foreigners, and the new Burmese state, cannot find place for this. So this will perhaps one of the reasons why Aung San Suu Kyi has been so cautious in dealing with this is, I think, a very clear recognition that her position as a political leader, popular political leader, can be overnight swept away if, in fact, she takes a public stand which is contrary to this growing sentiment that you find not just with the clergy and the army, but, as I said, amongst the Burmese population.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. In many ways, it seems to me that there are very interesting parallels with a number of other countries where you had democratic transitions, which have also led to ethnic sort of conflicts, and in exactly the same way that Ambassador Saran was talking about. But I just wanted to sort of come back to this question of not just Aung San Suu Kyi, but of mainstream Burmese democratic politics, right, which was such a strong force under such adverse circumstances fought. Now, even if you leave out, say, Aung San Suu Kyi, there are other leaders like Kokogi, who's a major sort of icon of democracy in Burma, who's given very incendiary statements on the Rohingya issue, right? I mean, more or less saying that if necessary, we will be with the army in order to sort of do this stuff, right? So clearly, what you are seeing is a rise of a new form of nationalism. And the NLD, I think, as a party, I mean, again, I think you should not just personalize it to Aung San Suu Kyi, however big an icon she is, right? The NLD did not field a single Muslim candidate for the last election. I mean, they didn't give any ticket to anyone, right? So I just want you to sort of reflect a little bit on that as well.
Thank you, Saran. Thank you, Srinath. I think you're right about, I think we need to try and answer that. Let me, I think, also add to what Ambassador Saran said about Aung San Suu Kyi, really, when you look at her, to see where she is coming from, and I absolutely agree with you, Srinath, when you say that you can't really isolate her and single her out, rather, she's, however powerful she may be as an actor. I think some of this has to also do with the fact that I think we need to make a distinction between what Aung San Suu Kyi, and now this is as a shorthand for NLD or what the democratic forces, and why are we seeing this very rather puzzling sort of dichotomy, and why are they speaking from two sides of the mouth? That sort of we are puzzled when we look in on the situation. I think it also has to do with the fact that let's differentiate between, make a distinction between what Aung San Suu Kyi can do and from what she is willing to do. So, so some of that, I think, is what she can do is, we know there are structural limitations. Just to add to what both of you said, we know that, for instance, the Tatmada or the military controls 25% of the seats in the parliament, and controls most of the key ministries. So there, in a sense, the new democratic power sharing, whatever the transition that Myanmar is undergoing, has already institutionalized a very skewed power sharing structure, and also institutionalized parallel power structures. So that, in a sense, is where the limitations are, about what are the checks she on her and her party, or any of the more liberal progressive forces which want to take on the slow transition. Mind you, it's a very nascent transition from the militaries. It's just 6 years old. It started in 2011. So that's first. And the second is also, if I may add what I think, I don't know how much this is relevant, but I think it's enormously relevant to understand where she's coming from. She is a Theravada Buddhist herself. And the Theravada Buddhists, as we all know, is an order which is highly conservative, and with a focus on monastic discipline and doctrine. So her running room, her wiggle room is limited, and that is something that is we can see why it is so. It's not really difficult to understand that. Now, but be that as it may, I feel, even though she works under difficult political restrictions, I would like to also add that she also has significant political strengths. First, is there is this halo around her because of her huge stature, and she has significant political capital, which she hasn't as yet utilized, and which she will have to, because she is, as Ambassador Saran said, she is, at the end of the day, today, a politician, and as a political actor, she will have to make certain. She can. So the question really I asked myself is, can she do more? And I think yes, absolutely. I don't see her as quite the beleaguered political actor that is made out to be in the press. Yes, of course, there are these, as I myself mentioned, we are aware of it. But she has significant political strength she can play to. And what are the few things she can do? At least three things I think she can do to redress, or to address some of the deep schisms that are breaking up or ravaging the country today. The first is, when you look at her campaign speeches or her initial her statements after she took office, her priority has been to create to be a balance, to create a reconciliation between the military and the ethnic armed groups. So let's be fair and try and look at her, how she has performed on that count. Now, there itself, we can very clearly see she hasn't got very far, and you can see that that's also fundamentally because she and the Tatmada, she and the military really have set a very inflexible precondition for participation in the peace process. And the precondition goes something like this. They said that all the ethnic armed groups in Myanmar, that there are about 15 of them, should sign ceasefire agreements prior to coming to the political dialogue. So now that, given the huge history and the troubled history that both Ambassador Saran and Srinath mentioned, that is like a big ask, to ask the ethnic armed groups to surrender and come to the table. So to cut a long story short, 8 out of 15 ethnic armed groups signed these initial ceasefire agreements, but when Aung San Suu Kyi came to office, she convened a few months ago national reconciliation peace process, something called the 21st Century Panglong Reconciliation Conference. And at that, just to give you a sense of what is the measure or the index or the barometer of trust that is there in among the groups, seven of the prominent non-signatories walked out. So the second conference that was to happen in February, in the hope that they'll be able to stitch up some sort of a agreement, didn't happen, and now the standstill continues. So to rewind, the first thing fundamentally that Aung San Suu Kyi as a leader can do is to give clear future directions for the peace process, and this is, in a sense, the answer to Myanmar's troubled ethnic question lies in a sleepy little town in eastern Myanmar. Since we are talking about history, the answer to that lies in a sleepy little town in eastern Myanmar, in a place called Panglong, in the Shan state, where incidentally and importantly, her own father, Aung San, signed a historic agreement with the Kachins, the Shans, and the I forget one, Chins. So, and that in essence is called the Union Agreement. That actually is the basis or the foundation of the country itself. And that, not surprisingly, really, was never fulfilled. And that is a promise that the Panglong promise remained only on paper, virtually. And what did it essentially, include? It included a significant promise of autonomy in the frontier areas. So that is the first fundamental steps, and obviously the Rohingyas were completely absent there. So, and given the radicalization, as Ambassador Saran said, about with the ARSA coming in, and increased radicalization likely, she will really need to sit herself down and figure out a way to get that process going. And she'll have to drop some of the preconditions she is already and that way she should also, as I see it, it'll be if good sense prevails, she would also like to subtly distance herself from the military position. So that's the first step she can do. The second, very quickly, is to ensure whenever repatriation takes place from Bangladesh, that the process she should ensure the safety and security of the returnees. And here, very often when we talk about the actors, very often the refugee is voiceless. And here I'd like to say that the refugee doesn't just have a right of return, he or she also has a right of refusal. And as we know, Myanmar has had two repatriation exercises, one in 1978, the other which was drawn out over a few years in mid-1990s, when the refugees actually refused to return. I mean, that was the initial paranoia because they feared for their lives. So some of that she can assuage, and so that repatriation takes place with respecting and safeguarding their safety and security, and I think that would be a fundamental confidence building measure. And the third really is, as Ambassador Saran said, Rakhine is really the site of a huge developmental thrust, both by her own government, and also a lot of foreign investors. And she can begin by looking at very, very simple livelihood issues. The Rohingyas, the community in Rakhine, the illiteracy rate is a staggering 80%. So simple trust building exercises like, which address the employment, education, health needs of this extremely traumatized, beleaguered community would go a long way in beginning to build the framework of trust. Thank you.
And I think, maybe for starters, she should also start using the word Rohingyas to refer to those people, right? I mean,